We have some new people in the room, so I would just like to repeat, because I don't know who gave photo permission and who did not, that we are live streaming today. You can only see the slides and the speakers on the screen at the moment, but if you don't want to be seen, then when you ask questions, you should remain at the back, because we're not going to change the direction of the camera. And well, of course, for any other presentation, if you did not get permission, photo permission, you are not going to be shared. And now we can start with the kind of substantial part of the summit, although I think that both of our opening people gave us some food for thought and things that we can carry forward for the coming days. For that reason, it's a great pleasure for me to invite our first speaker. I'm going to start with a story. I think it was about 4 years ago, I found a very interesting tweet by a lady I've never heard of, I have to tell you, although I know quite a few researchers in the field of parental involvement engagement through a network called ERNE, European Research Network about Parenting Education. But I've never heard her name, but I found a very interesting topic, and she shared an article that I couldn't download because I needed some academic access to it, and I wrote a personal email or little message on Twitter. I went to the UK in a few weeks after that, and this fantastic lady made her husband to drive her to the place where I was, that was like 150 kilometers from her. We met at a pub, we started chatting, and we realized that we cannot really stop chatting. They drove me to London, we had dinner together, and we've been in touch ever since. And while I still don't understand why the European Research Network about Parenting Education and Janet Goodall are not linked, I think that it's a great honor for us to have her here, and I would like to give the floor to you. And I hope you don't mind this kind of personal introduction.
I have something in each hand. This can't go well. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. This is where I work. This is just a quick overview of some of the work I've done, just as much as anything to prove, if you like, that I'm a real person and not Geppetto's puppet. But one thing that isn't on there is giving a keynote for the Scottish Children's University at Edinburgh, which I very much enjoy. But that just gives you a sort of overview of some. I don't know if any of you have ever done a literature review. Anybody ever done a literature review? They're a joy and a wonder, aren't they? I've done 6 or 7 of them. I don't want to do any more, but they are there. That's just to give you an idea. The first thing I want to say is that when I say parents, I mean an adult with a carrying responsibility for a child. So that's far too long to keep saying. So when I say parents, that's what I want you to hear. It's not just about biological parents. It's about whoever is caring for the child. And increasingly, we know that that's grandparents. And I'll come back to that. But one of the things that we often miss is we talk about parents, particularly in my work with schools, as being on the receiving end of education. And parents receiving information. As Esther's already said, parents are the first and best educators of their children. We've got to stop thinking of them as being on the receiving end or the demand side. They're also part of the supply side. And that is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And if we had more time, I would ask you to turn to the person next to you and explain how to tie shoes without using your hands. Because you've all done that with your children, and that is just one of the most difficult things going. Or maybe it was just me. But we know about grandparents, and there's an idea that families are moving from what's been called from a pyramid to a beanpole. In other words, we have fewer people in each generation, but more generations interacting. Grandparents are living longer, they're being healthy longer, they're involved with their children longer, and because of the austerity measures in a number of countries, they may be getting their pensions later. But we do know that for most grandparents, taking an active role can be quite beneficial. It certainly can be quite beneficial for children. But again, when we say parents, quite often we mean grandparents, we mean aunts, uncles, whatever. Why should we care about engaging parents with learning? Well, first off, can I ask how many of you are parents? Nothing I say today is meant to make you feel that you are not doing a good job. The world is full of people telling parents they aren't doing it. As a matter of fact, could you turn to the person next to you and tell them they're doing a good job? Just turn to the person next to you. Tell them they're doing a good job. It's amazing the difference that makes, even if you don't know the person next to you and they don't know what job you're doing. How often do we say that to parents? In any situation. The world's full of people who will tell parents off for doing things wrong, who will judge parents. But how often do we say to a parent, I've really enjoyed listening to you talk to your children. I've attained grandmother age, I can do that now. And I do it. But why should we care about this? From my point of view, this is an issue of social justice. And that's where it starts and where it comes back to. And just a few stats. I am by training and inclination a theologian, so this is as much math as you're going to get from me. But we know that children are more at risk of poverty than or social exclusion than most other groups. And it's not through anything they've done. You can't say that a child who is facing poverty has refused to work. There are stats here that you can go through it, but basically we know all of this. We know that children and older people are more at risk of poverty and social exclusion than any other group in Europe, and it depends on where you are, how bad that issue is. But we also know it's increasing in a lot of areas. I do a lot of work in Scotland, and 1 in 5 children in Scotland is facing poverty or social exclusion. 1 in 4 children in England is facing poverty or social exclusion. I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's right. It's not the society I really want to grow up in. And this is, I'm grown up, but it's not the society I want children to grow up in. We know that children who are facing poverty in school, these are UK statistics, but they work throughout a great deal of Europe as well, are 6 times as likely to leave school without qualifications, with everything that means in terms of life chances, life expectancy, getting a job. They're more likely to leave school early. And according to the older literature, and unfortunately you still see this flagged often, they're more likely to have lower aspirations. That is the older literature. Newer literature says that children and parents have high expectations across the board in terms of background. But what parents in poverty or facing social exclusion lack is not high aspirations, but it's scaffolding for those aspirations. It's knowing how to make those aspirations come true. Does that make some sense? So we need to actually start thinking about that. And if you're interested in that, may I recommend the work of Professor Morag Traynor. That's Treanor. I think I may have that. But I can easily send that to you. Basically, children who don't do well in school, of whatever form school takes, are at risk of underachievement and poverty. There's Traynor. This is a paper she wrote at the request of civil servants, which is always interesting, and the paper is called Can We Put the Myth of the Poverty of Aspirations to Bed Now? It's available freely online, and if you drop me an email, I can always send it to you or send you the link. But even more problematically, and if you've worked in schools long enough, you've seen this, children who grow up in poverty tend to raise their children in poverty. Children who underachieve at school tend to have children who underachieve at school. This is not genetic. There is a prominent discourse now, particularly in the UK, about the poor are just not as intelligent as the rich. That is not true, in spite of what Twitter will tell you. This is about social justice, and it's about socioeconomic status. So where are we now in terms of Europe broadly defined, and that's as much as I'm going to say about that coming from the UK. We know in Denmark, parents are in the majority on governing bodies, which I believe is unique in Europe. But they still don't have an influence on curriculum. In Austria, England, Poland, and Slovakia, parents are involved in governing bodies, but that doesn't mean that they have that much influence. Parental opinions are sought in most of these countries, but including Japan and Hungary. That doesn't actually sound like a really impressive role for parents in terms of children's schooling. And I found a report last week, which I found was really interesting. And can I ask if any of you were involved in early years or primary education? These are the people we need to be talking to, because early years practitioners are so much better at this and tend to recognize so much of what's going on. So this is what's going on in early years across Europe. Every kindergarten in Norway must have a parent council. Flanders centres must have policies to promote parental involvement. But does that actually mean it's making a difference? Are policies the same as practice? And any of us who have worked in education in any form whatsoever know that policies and practice don't always work. And it seems to be that the more centralized the state education system, the less parents are involved in the system in general. Does that make some sense? Yeah. So the more centralized we get, although it doesn't necessarily mean that if you decentralize, parents get more involved. It would be nice if it meant that, but it doesn't actually work that way. The OECD talks about a vicious cycle, and I think that this will be recognizable to a lot of people. Parents are perceived as not interested because they don't rock up to the things that schools put on, and then schools don't put things on because the parents haven't come. Now those of you with, does anybody have teenagers or have had teenagers? Would you go to a parental experience at school that said how to handle teenage problem behavior? Probably not, because what is that saying about you as a parent? When a school put on the same program and called it, I've got a teenager, get me out of here, they had to go get extra chairs. Sometimes it's about asking, but often schools say to me, well, we put stuff on for parents and nobody came. Well, did you ask parents what they actually wanted? Oh. So there's this, what the OECD calls a vicious cycle. Does that sound familiar to anybody? So we suffer from something that has been called civil service-itis, which is something must be done, this is something, therefore we will do it. Does that sound at all familiar to people? And the last thing, I work with schools very frequently, and the last thing I want to do is say to schools, oh, here are 5 new things you need to do next week, because that often gets you actually physically hurt. Schools have enough to be going on with. We need to stop doing things simply because they sound like a good idea, or they're what comes in a shiny binder. And we've got to start doing things that are shown by research to work. That does not mean that what works in your school will work in your school, but it does mean that if it's working in your school, there's a very good chance it could work in yours if you adapt it. Sorry, you two happen to be sitting there. If you adapt it to your school environment. We know that around 80% of the difference in the achievement of children, this was work in the States, but it carries out throughout most of Europe, is down to their background. It's down to what happens outside of school, which makes a great deal of sense. Because most schools don't say, well, look, you 3 are in receipt of benefits or on free school meals, don't try to learn this. Schools don't do that. Although if schools are streaming viability, that's precisely what they're doing, by the way. But what the difference is what you come into school with, what you carry home with you, how you can relate that to what happens outside of school. So we've got to stop asking schools to fix this problem and actually start working with families. Those of you who have children, did any of you send your children to preschool or something before school started, some organized form of education? Did any of you have well-meaning relatives that told you this was bad, evil, and wrong and you shouldn't do that? It's usually not. I'm not sure why. There's an arts union somewhere. Kathy Silva and her team from Oxford followed children from the time they were rising 4 to the time they left primary school. And even at the end of primary school, they could see benefits for some form of early education. So you were right, and your relative was wrong. But what they actually found, and which changed the direction of a lot of subsequent work, is that it's not about who parents are. It's about what parents do. And one of the things that we were talking about in the taxi here is that I'm always fascinated by teachers who say, well, you know what parents are like, even though they are themselves parents. I find that really fascinating. So there are a number of phrases I want you to get rid of, and one of them is, that's what can you expect from that kind of parent. What you can expect from parents is that they love their children and want the best for their children. So I think the missing link in closing the gap, in the economic related gap, and I apologize, I should say narrowing, rather than closing. Because the only way to close the gap is to have an exclusive system, and I don't want to have an exclusive system, so that should say narrowing. Is parental engagement in children's learning. And for those of you that are into statistics, I recommend Professor Garrod's work, because so is he, and he actually understands them. And having looked at the statistics around what works, this is what he and his team said. Parental involvement in their child's learning really is where we should be putting our money. The problem is that when I say parental engagement in school, what people hear may not be what I mean. Have you ever had an argument with somebody because you said something that they misinterpreted and you used the same word differently? Yeah. Well, when I went into schools a few years ago, but it still carries on, when I asked teachers, school staff, what they mean by parental engagement, this is what they say. It's about reading in class, it's about going on trips, it's about going to parents' evening. That has no effect on achievement whatsoever. 0.01% effect on achievement. Because the parents that can do that can do everything else that we need to do to support children in the system we have. I see a lot of people nodding. When I asked parents, this is what they said. It's about homework and it's about keeping track of coursework. And if you have teenagers that are doing secondary work, keeping track of their coursework is a full-time job. I got a phone call once that told me that my daughter had missed her French GCSE exam. And we panicked for about 20 minutes until we remembered she was doing Spanish. Never name your child a popular name. But those of you with teenagers, I want you to think what your teenagers would say if a researcher, not you, if a researcher asked them what was important about what their parents can do. Because that's what we did. And the teenagers, the secondary students, told us it was about moral support. And what we heard over and over again was, somebody has to ask how my day went. Which fascinated me, because as far as I know, my children did nothing in organized education, because that's what they told me. I would dutifully say, what did you do in school today? Nothing. At this point, while I was doing this, I was having to drop my children off around the corner from school, because my car was embarrassing. So I was beginning to try to figure out what was going on. So I started asking. And I remember asking one young woman in a very depressing area of London, well, do you answer her? She said, God, no, miss. But if she's not home, I go around all my aunties until I find her, and then I make her ask me, and then I know she cares. But I ignore her. But somebody has to ask, because that's how I know that someone cares. So if you do have teenagers still at home, or even younger children that don't answer the question, doesn't matter, keep asking the question. Keep saying that you care. We also heard, miss, I'm not here for my health. I'm not wearing these silly clothes for my health. Uniforms are a thing in England and throughout Wales. I'm here because my parents think it's important. Would teenagers tell their parents that? No. Can you tell the parents you work with? Yes. And the other thing, really interestingly, was guidance. And I kept hearing this, I've never had a job, I've never gone to university. How do I know what I should be doing with my life? I'm looking to my parents for that information. And that was from teenagers. So do please feel free to share that with parents, because teenagers are telling them that they have no influence, and the world is telling them they have no influence. But in reality, they really do. That's what makes a difference. It's parents' engagement in children's learning, not involvement with schools. And just as an example, this is European research. Talking to your children, 15 minutes conversation a week with teenagers is correlated to their engagement with reading. And everybody always thinks that's got to be sitting down in a book-lined room going, darling, how do you feel about Nietzsche? It's really not. It's 15 minutes conversation around what they're watching, around what music they're listening to, around what they're doing on whatever social media platform happens to be the most impressive at the moment. Children of parents who value reading do more of it. Let your children see you read. That dates my children.